Hi there. So in the last episode, we talked about China. We talked about nationalism there. We've been looking at nationalism in many parts of the world. In particular, in this video, we're going to look at nationalism in India. And so, just a quick recap of what nationalism is. It's going to be an intense devotion, a love, based on history and culture for who you are as a national identity, as a group of people living in one single territory. And so India had been under the control of the British, and there had been two nationalistic groups that began to emerge that wanted to essentially oust the British. Okay, they wanted to get rid of them. Let me change my pen real quick. So they were looking to get them out so they could have their own country. They could, self-determination is what they were looking for. And these two groups were the Indian National Conference or Congress, excuse me, and the Muslim League. Now, obviously, you've got the Indian here, which is going to represent mainly the Hindus, and you've got the Muslim League. So right there, you can already kind of see this thick contrast between the religious groups that make up the majority of the populace here in the Indian subcontinent. And so it really was a division on the basis of their religion. So after during World War I, Indians thought that if they helped the British win the war and they participated in the fighting, which they did, they thought that they would be able to get self-rule, and that ended up not being true. So the British had well, I guess the Indians had just kind of fell into this trap of thinking that maybe the British would reward them for their hard work and their effort towards helping the British war effort. Indians showed out, but the British passed the Rollout Acts. Okay, so what I mean by they showed out is they protested. All right, they wanted self-determination. They wanted to have their own country, and they protested the British. And so the British put out these Rollout Acts, which allows them to put Indians in jail for up to 2 years. With no trial. Okay, so you gotta think that many of these Hindus or many of these Indians, Hindus and Muslims alike, had Western education. Now, um, you remember when we were talking about the Enlightenment movement and that whole idea, the very notion of the uh, the right to trials, the criminal justice reform by Beccaria, and all these different things. These are Western ideas, and so it goes against the very idea of what the West is for the Western British to say to the Indians, many of who have Western education, that you can't protest, and if you do, you're going to be put in jail for up to a period of 2 years without a trial. And so they felt completely duped, like this is contradictory to everything that they've been raised to believe, and also everything that the British believed. So what happened was many of these Hindus and Muslims, okay, Hindus and Muslims, very important that you recognize that both groups showed up at Amritsar, which is a very holy city, mainly to the Sikhs in the Punjab province in northern India. And the whole purpose here was protest. It was designed to be a peaceful protest consisting of things like prayer and things like political talks. Okay, so they weren't, you know, there wasn't any violence, or they weren't doing anything other than just it was a large gathering of thousands of Hindus and Muslims alike that would get together to pray about and protest the way that the British had been uh, dominating the political scene in India. So the British viewed this as a dangerous form of nationalism, and they were thinking, well, these Hindus and Muslims, one, it's dangerous that both of them are teaming up. Number two, they had already banned the right to protest in India, and they thought that this was an example of the Indians openly fighting against a British law. And so the British officer in charge in that region had his troops open fire for about 10 minutes, resulting in 400 deaths and 1,200 wounded. It's almost like you hear on the news of some of these shootings. I mean, I would imagine that this would be very similar to that. They didn't know, there was no warning at all, and they were just, many of them died, many of them were wounded. And so what this did was it made nationalists out of many people that otherwise would have probably been loyal British. So at this point, if anyone was on the fence, they were no longer on the fence in India. And at this point, you also see Mohandas Gandhi, right? This guy, begins to emerge as a new nationalist leader during this movement. And Gandhi, as I go the wrong direction, Gandhi is this guy right here, and I'm sure that you guys have all heard of him, even if you don't know a lot about him. He was known as the Great Soul. Okay, he was just a good person. Like, no matter what religion you might have been affiliated with, everyone can agree that Gandhi was just an amazing character who did amazing things for Indian nationalism. And what he does is he's Hindu, but he doesn't just draw from the teachings of only the Hindu religion, but he recognizes the diversity in India, and he draws teachings from all of these great faiths of world history. And in particular, he looks out for the rights of people in India, regardless of their religion. And so later on, that's going to get him in trouble, as many Hindus didn't support his stance of peace towards Muslims. And so what he does is he uses a form of protest that he calls civil disobedience. And so rather than violence, which has really not worked up to this point, and also gives, usually will accompany a justification, so the British would have some kind of justification for being harsh towards the Indians. He wanted to take away from British authority simply by this form of civil disobedience, by protesting and doing things that are going to weaken how they're perceived in India, and also physically weaken their presence in India, but um, without cause of violence. And so this is how he believed the Indians would achieve political independence. It was deliberate, and it was a public refusal to obey the unjust laws that the British imposed on the Indians. And so examples of this: don't buy British goods, don't buy or don't pay British taxes that didn't make sense or weren't right. Don't attend British-run government schools. There was another thing where many of the Indians would buy. They were made to buy certain goods like salt and like clothing from the British. And so what Gandhi did was he challenged them all to make their own clothes, make their own yarns, and sew their own clothes. This is a lot of work, all right? But actually, most of these protests were extremely successful. So people actually listened to Gandhi, and this would actually hit the British very, very hard in the long run. So there was a lot of good that came from his civil disobedience. People respected Gandhi and listened to him. And so the effects here is that the British economy went down. Overcrowded jails went down. Peaceful protests, despite the best efforts, riots still occurred. So there weren't always going to be these peaceful protests, but the point was made, and it did, in fact, help the nationalist movement in India. And probably the most influential of all of these peaceful protests would have been the Salt March. We're a little note here. What this is the British would tax. I'm sorry, the British had a monopoly over the salt that was bought by the Indians, and so they required the Indians to buy salt only from them. And salt is one of those things that you can't live your life without it. You really need it for all sorts of cooking and preserving certain things and all these other stuff. And so the Indians needed to have it. The British were the ones who had the sole monopoly over selling it to them. And so what Gandhi did was, he wouldn't buy salt from other places, but he would have these Indians march to the sea so that they could make their own salt as a form of civil disobedience. And so the British were not very happy about this, but it was really successful. And after this salt march, many of the demonstrators marched to shut down a nearby salt processing facility. It should be a salt processing facility. And at that point, the British responded, and many of them were beaten with steel-tipped clubs in the head. People were injured severely. There was a lot of coverage. All right, so at this point, you start to really see the forces of globalization at work here. And newspapers had covered this all across the world. In the West, many people began to support Indian nationalism. So you start to really see the effects of a global world, and I guess global access to information at this point is going to really play a leading role in this national movement. So in 1935, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act. Now, this right here really is kind of the first time that you really see the benefits of all these peaceful protests that Gandhi had put forth. And so, what this was it was essentially limited self-rule for India. Now, it wasn't straight up independence, despite the fact that the I'm sorry, the Indians were going to fight in World War II, and that they were committed to the war even without the consent of Indians. Um, Full out independence wasn't really on the table, but what this did was, for the first time, entertain the idea that they were getting close. And you've got this contrast that we just talked about between the Hindus and Muslims, right? And what this really kind of does is it it puts the focus on what's going to happen when the British are out. Who's going to rule? And so, despite the mutual disdain for the British, Hindus and Muslims absolutely did not get along. And Muslims here, they were the minority. All right, so they were more minor no, minority. Sorry, there were more Hindus than there were Muslims, and so if the Muslims would kind of adhere to the idea that they would even be rather be ruled by the British than to be ruled by Hindus that fought for the rights of Hindus and not on behalf of Muslims. And so you've got that powerful conflict right there in Indian politics that people are starting to really question. And so we already discussed the Muslim League. We discussed the Congress Party. Okay, so the Muslim League is straight up for Muslims, and they are afraid of an Indian majority. British rule in exchange for Hindu rule, probably not something that most of them wanted to do. They also fought to protect Muslim interests from mainly Hindu Congress Party. Now, the Congress Party did have some Muslims in it, but it was overwhelmingly mostly Hindu, and the Muslim League would take many of the Muslims out of the Congress Party as they fought for the rights of strictly Muslim interest. All right, so the Congress Party also represented, obviously, the majority of the population. So this guy right here, his name is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and he says the only thing the Muslim has in common with the Hindu is his slavery to the British. So if there's no commonality and they can't agree politically on who gets power and how that's going to look in India, then we definitely have a situation. All right, we definitely have a situation. So who should be in power? Questions that need answering, right? The British were in a pickle. The British didn't want to pull out of India and leave them to their own devices if it's going to be just a complete crap show. And so what they decided they were going to do is, if they couldn't get the Hindus and the Muslims to make a government together and get along, then probably the best thing to do would be this, what they called a partition. All right. So it is exactly as it sounds. You're going to divide the territory between the two different groups on the basis of their nationality. And so Muslims refused to share the government with Hindus. There was no other obvious choice. And so this right here is just an image that I drew that kind of looks like what, or I guess demonstrates what was actually happening here. So you can see that the lines that I've drawn here would represent uh, the Muslim territory, and you've got lines on the west, and you've got lines on the east. So the large Muslim populations that lived in the east and the west would have to remain within those territories, and those would be Muslim territories. But there were also a lot of Hindus, in these regions here, and there was also a lot of Hindus in this region, and also there was a lot of Muslims in the mainland area. And so what you end up seeing here is that there's going to have to be this massive interregional migration or internal migration where these two groups are going to kind of migrate into the territories that were partitioned for their nationality. And as you might can imagine, there's going to be a lot of conflict that occurs. So one thing I did want to point out is that the mainland area that is in the white here, that would be what would become India, and the area that I designated with the lines going through it would become Pakistan, and Pakistan would be represented by the Muslims and India by the Hindus. And even today, this is how it is, except that this little area right here is now Bangladesh. Hopefully I'll spell that right. Bangladesh, because it's really difficult to govern a territory that's divided by land between the east and the west, and so eventually the Bangladesh is going to become an independent country. Okay, and so the partition was a logistical mess. Nobody really knew the best way to get people from one part of the territory to the other. So Hindus that needed to go to the Hindu area, it was very difficult. Muslims had to go to the Muslim area. They would cross paths, as you can see here in the arrows that I drew. And there was conflict. There was a lot of conflict when this would occur. And so they had to divide bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, by the way, is going to be the people that do like the day-to-day work of the government. Okay, so you think about bureaucracy in the United States, that would be the same as like the mailman. Okay, the government's job is to deliver the mail. Part of that massive bureaucracy would be even low. Something you wouldn't think would be like a government job, but something that the government's going to pay for to do its day to day. Like a mailman is a good example of that. They had to relocate the Muslims and Hindus, and they relocated other religious groups who had to decide where they wanted to be as well. And some of those religious groups would have been Sikhs and Jains. There are large groups of these religious groups within India, but they don't come close to the size of the numbers of the population that are going to be Hindu and Muslim. Sikhs, by the way, are going to primarily live in the Punjab. We were just talking about where the holy city of Amritsar is. And there was going to be killing, obviously, during this migration that would occur, you know, as people were going and coming. Gandhi looks at this and he observes, what is there to celebrate? I see nothing but rivers of blood. And the reason is because there were going to be about 1 million people that were going to die during this transfer, during this internal migration. He went to Delhi and he was going to fight for the fair treatment of Muslims. I mean, so it's not that this violence wasn't happening on both sides, but the Muslims are going to be the minority group, and so he wanted to make sure that everybody knew where he stood. He feels that the rights of Muslims and Hindus should be preserved as people make this migration into the territory that was partitioned for them. And even while he was going to protest this violence towards the Muslims, he becomes himself a victim, and he was killed by an extreme Hindu who believed that he made too many compromises on the behalf of the Muslim groups. And so you can imagine that if they're going to turn on Gandhi, the political situation here in India was pretty bad during all this. And so even today, you still see a lot of, I guess, conflict between Muslims and Hindus in this area, in particular over the Kashmir area, which is still, like, if you watch the news, you can still see this, where this is happening. In fact, recently, it's been in the news even more so than usual. It's still something that happens because the Hindus are the ones who are in control of that area mainly, but a lot of the people that live there are Muslim, and so they want to be an autonomous region, and both sides are pulling weight against that. So in particular, the Indian the Hindu group. So that's it for this video, and I will see you guys on the next video. Peace out.